Hello and welcome everyone to our bi-monthly Fairness First X Talk. My name is Carmelita Chief and I will be your host for this duration of 1 hour. My name again is Carmelita Chief. I am a Senior Research Coordinator at the Southwest Health Equity Research Collaborative at Northern Arizona in Flagstaff, Arizona. So as we have folks starting to trickle in, we'll give people at least 1 more minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started with our talk here. But again, huge appreciation for those of you who have joined us today. We're very excited to have you. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you again for all of you who have joined us this afternoon from 12 o'clock to 1 o'clock. It is our bi-monthly Fairness First X Talk, which is sponsored through the Southwest Health Equity Research Collaborative at NAU, Northern Arizona University in Flagstaff, Arizona. We are so happy and privileged to have our second speaker join us. Here we have Joseph R. Mihaljevic. Dr. Mihaljevic is an assistant professor at Northern Arizona University in the School of Informatics, Computing, and Cyber Systems. And today he will be talking on the topic of, can we predict West Nile virus like we predicted the weather? But before we go straight into Dr. Mihaljevic's talk, I do want to give a brief overview about what is the Fairness First X Talk, who puts it on, and what is the purpose of these bi-monthly virtual discussion spaces. So Fairness First, first and foremost, it's the Southwest Health Equity Research Collaborative, or SHERC, at NAU. At SHERC, we believe that health equity research needs to be grounded in practice and in a message that connects with communities that are most directly impacted by health inequities. And many of these, and we need to recognize that many of these communities are already participating in action and are directly involved in taking action to advance health equity or fairness, which is another word for health equity, health fairness, for their community. So the Fairness First X Talk series is an initiative of the Fairness First campaign, which was created by SHERC at NAU, and the Fairness First X Talks, or what we call FFX for short, FFX Talks. They occur every other month through Zoom, and were developed to be a space for connection, for collective learning or co-learning, learning alongside others, and really to spark curiosity about research as being a valuable approach to advance health equity or health fairness here in the Southwest. And every other month, we invite health equity researchers and advocates to share what it is that they do and the work that they do, while also helping us to engage and to really think about how health equity how that framework of health equity is needed in research to help support the well-being of communities in the Southwest. And in some instances, this can be expanded to a global perspective. So with that, again, these are just photos so that you see the people behind SHERC at NAU. If you're familiar with Flagstaff, particularly with the target area, we are located in the Applied Research and Development Building, or the ARD, at the NAU campus. And just to kind of clarify some confusion that might arise, you're going to start to see this logo here. It will say Center for Health Equity Research. So SHERC is actually a part of the Center for Health Equity Research. Going forward, just a couple of Zoom community agreements that I want to go over with you all. We want to make sure that this is a space for interaction where people's comments and thoughts are welcome, but we also want to make sure that we do this in a respectful manner. So I have a couple of guidelines here that I would like to go over. So please, if you can, keep your camera on if possible. And this is really just to help strengthen that human to human engagement with one another and with Dr. Mihaljevic. Second, please stay muted during your talk if possible. I will go ahead and offer some reminders of that throughout if we have any distractions. And then last of all, please stay engaged in the conversation and feel free to participate during our question and answers and some of the interactive exercises that Dr. Mihaljevic will have for us. I went a little bit too far. So with that, I am happy to introduce our speaker, Dr. Joseph Mihaljevic. And from here on, he is going to share his PowerPoint slides and we'll get to know a little bit more about him and what he does.
Thanks, Carmelita, for that introduction. Let me just pull up my slides here. Are you able to see that, Carmelita? Okay, thanks. And it's a little bit hard for me to monitor the chat during the talk, but I think some folks from Share will be helping monitor that. So or you're welcome to unmute yourself and chime in. It's totally fine if you interrupt, at least on my end. I don't know if the moderators want that, but so yeah, today I'm going to talk pretty broadly about, can we predict the risk of West Nile virus like we predict the weather? And before I start, I really want to acknowledge key collaborators and partners on this project. So first is Dr. Crystal Hepp, who's also in the School of Informatics and the Pathogen and Microbiome Institute at NAU. And Crystal's really been the one that's engaged with our government partners on this project and has built this project from the ground up for her research career. And I was brought on a couple of years ago to tackle this component of the project. And I want to acknowledge other collaborators, Dr. Ben Ruddle, and two graduate students who have helped on the project, Whitney and Stefan, as well as our key collaborators in the state government. So Maricopa County Vector Control Division, as well as Arizona Department of Health Services. And then I also want to acknowledge the Center for Health Equity Research, as well as Share for funding part of this project. And feel free to reach out to me over email, or my professional Twitter is also listed at the bottom here. So the first thing I want to start with today is a question for you all. And so you can participate with this question through Poll Everywhere. And so if you use your smartphone, if you go to the camera, you can actually hover over this QR code right here, and it should pop up with a link to the Poll Everywhere, where you can answer this question of, what do you think of when you hear West Nile virus? You could also text my long name and the numbers to this number here. And so I'll just give you a second to hover over that QR code and navigate to the website. And this is a free response. So once you get to the website, you can just kind of type whatever comes to mind when you hear West Nile virus. Okay, I'm going to switch the slide, but the text and the website will still be on the next slide. Great. So it looks like there are some responses coming in. So we've got mosquitoes, climate change, season.
Joe, there might be a lag on my end, but I'm not seeing the answers pop up on my screen.
Really?
Yeah.
Not sure why that is. Do other people see the answers?
I do not, but it says to start the presentation to see the live content. So I don't know if there's a play button that you're supposed to press.
That's so strange because I see it on my. Okay, we're gonna.
Please share for screen share software, share the entire screen. Maybe that's.
I have the whole screen shared. Hold on.
Yeah, you might have to make something about making the question live, something like that. Yeah.
Did that.
So if you go to your.
I'm just gonna share a different part of my screen. Sorry, everyone. Yay, technology. Okay. Can you see
Here
this?
we go. Yes, we see it now.
Okay. So I wonder, you're not seeing all of them though. Oh no, you probably shouldn't see that. Oh, you'll see them kind of roll in.
Yeah, we see them coming in.
So we've got mosquitoes, lots of mosquitoes. On my end, I also saw seasonality, climate change, vectors, an RNA virus. Here we go. So I think we're to the end of it now. Mosquito bites. Yeah, so mosquitoes is definitely a popular one here. Far away, interesting. Mosquito-borne disease, not urgent. Okay, I'm gonna stop this sharing and go back. Okay, so a lot of you talked about mosquitoes, and that's because, like the chat said, this is a mosquito-borne pathogen. So West Nile virus is an RNA virus that circulates in the environment. So an adult Culex mosquito will come into contact and feed upon birds, different species of birds in the natural environment. And if they pick up a blood meal, sometimes these birds are infected with West Nile virus. And if they take that blood meal, the mosquitoes can become infected with the virus. And these mosquitoes are pretty generalist, meaning that they'll feed upon lots of different animals, including humans. And so if an infected mosquito comes and bites a human, that human may become infected. But what's interesting is that if a human becomes infected, they can't produce enough virus in their bloodstream to actually infect another mosquito. So we're what's called a dead end host for the virus. And so the risk of West Nile virus exposure to humans is totally dependent on what's happening in the natural environment and the interactions between mosquitoes and birds. And so that's a lot about what I'm going to talk today. So West Nile virus does cause disease in humans. You know, someone in that chat that we had said not urgent, and maybe this is why that sentiment is coming up. But most people who become exposed to West Nile virus, so if you're bitten by a mosquito that has West Nile virus, you may become infected, and the vast majority of people will not show symptoms of the virus. So 80% of infections are not symptomatic. However, about 20% so almost all of the remaining infections may show fever, achiness, kind of flu-like symptoms, whereas less than 1% of illnesses will become a serious form of illness that can cause, that can lead to mortality in some instances. And this causes brain swelling of the brain and of the spinal cord. And currently there are no vaccines or specific medicines to fight West Nile virus infection. And because most infections are non-symptomatic or have kind of generalized symptoms like the flu or the cold, many of the cases that are out there are not reported. And most of the time we only see reports of more serious illness. So 2021 has been a huge year for West Nile virus. So far this year, across all of the US, there have been over 2,500 cases reported. Over 1,500 of those cases have been severe disease. And so far this year, 150 deaths have been linked to West Nile virus. So compared to lots of other diseases out there, yes, this isn't high mortality. However, these severe disease cases actually have a high economic burden because cases of West Nile virus that end in hospitalization, these individuals can be in the hospital for a long period of time until West Nile virus is cleared from their system or until, unfortunately, they die. Now, if we look across the United States, there's different spatial patterns that we can see in West Nile virus. In Arizona, in particular, there's greater than one case of severe disease per 100,000 population so far in 2021. And you can see these darker colors represent higher incidence or cases per 100,000 population. And you can see then that there's been higher incidence of West Nile virus in the Western, kind of central Western states. Now, Arizona does disproportionately contribute to the nationwide cases of West Nile virus. Arizona consistently has high rate of severe disease. For instance, so far this year, 881 severe disease cases have been reported from Arizona, and this represents 57% of all severe disease cases seen across the United States. So this is hugely disproportional. More than half of the cases so far this year have come from Arizona. Not only that, but Maricopa County, where Phoenix and Scottsdale are, so in the Valley, annually ranks in the top 10 US counties for West Nile virus cases. So across all the counties, the hundreds of counties in the US, Maricopa County is always in the top 10 of cases. And most of the cases from Arizona originate in Maricopa County. So that might beg the question, what's going on in Arizona and Maricopa County that can lead to these high case burdens? So if we remember, West Nile virus is dependent on what's going on in the natural environment between mosquitoes and birds, interactions between mosquitoes and birds. Well, if we think about then the life cycle of mosquitoes, let's talk about that a little bit. So an adult female mosquito, after it picks up a blood meal from a feeding host, it can then lay eggs into aquatic environments. So this just represents a little pond, or it could be even a small water ditch, for instance, in an agricultural field. It could be a pot that holds water in your backyard, but they lay eggs that become larvae. So this is just a little image of a mosquito larvae that then kind of develops in that water source and then eventually pupates into an adult mosquito that then can feed upon other hosts in the environment like birds or humans. Now, this life cycle of the mosquito is dependent on the natural conditions that are present, including how much water is available, which is linked to precipitation, as well as other human-derived sources of water like agriculture, irrigation, things like spraying lawns with water, or sewer systems or fountains, things like that, as well as temperature. So mosquitoes are ectotherms. The temperature of their body and the processes that occur, like their metabolism, are dependent on the environmental temperature. And their processes also like their ability to mate and breed and lay eggs. And in Maricopa County, we know that it's warm pretty much year round, which is distinct from other places in the country like the Northeast or the Midwest, in which there's hard freezing events, and even up here in Flagstaff where we have hard freezing events. And those hard freezing events are inhospitable to a lot of mosquitoes. But in Maricopa County, these mosquitoes can survive year round, which means that the virus inside the mosquitoes can also persist annually. And Dr. Crystal Hepp has done some great genetic work to show that each year in Maricopa County, the virus that emerges is resident or endemic to Maricopa County. So it sticks around, allowing Maricopa County to have annual outbreaks of West Nile virus, where in other states, there's not always an annual outbreak. And these mosquitoes actually have to come from somewhere else and seed the population with virus. Now, also precipitation and temperature can influence the bird populations that harbor the virus and that the mosquito feeds upon to spread the virus. So again, these transmission dynamics between the mosquitoes and the birds are dependent on the precipitation temperature, the climate, and the kind of the natural environment or the unnatural environment in which the mosquitoes can breed. Now, beyond what's happening with the climate, the weather, there are also social determinants of health and risk of West Nile virus exposure. So the definition of social determinants of health are the conditions in which people are born, grow, live, work, and age. For example, air quality, schools, parks, jobs, and housing conditions that might contribute to their risk of West Nile virus exposure. And so another question I want to ask of you is this. So don't start typing yet because I have to activate I think this activates it. So what social or demographic factors might influence the risk of exposure to West Nile virus? And you can use that same QR code. If it's already pulled up on your phone, it should update what question you're trying to answer. So I'll give you just a second to go to the QR code again, and then I'll pull up the responses. So again, what social or demographic factors, not the climate like weather or precipitation or temperature, but the social factors. Okay, so I'm going to switch to that other view now. Sorry, just give me a moment. Okay, so we have wealth, the ability to access fresh running water, poor crowded housing conditions, rurality, work environment, social economic status, housing, occupational exposures, employment that requires outdoor work, housing where you live, working in agriculture, being a farm worker, poverty, housing, work, housing conditions, including the age of the housing structures, travel, do you travel for work, economic conditions, city or county management. Good, we'll talk about some of these things. Thanks for participating, this is great. Okay, it looks like we've stopped rolling in, so I'm gonna switch back over. So that begs the question, how can we control West Nile virus risk? So Maricopa County Vector Control and Arizona Department of Health Services and health services across the country have many aspects of control, ranging from education, trying to educate the public about mosquitoes and how to control mosquitoes in their own environment. The county conducts intensive surveillance to track mosquito populations. We'll talk about that. They do experiments on mosquitoes to figure out how best to control their populations. There's removal of standing water where they breed. They use chemicals to kill adult and larval mosquitoes to keep their abundances down. And if you have less mosquitoes, it's less risk of getting bitten by mosquitoes and contracting viruses. They also respond actively to ongoing surveillance. So if they notice particular places in particular communities that are either complaining about mosquitoes or have high mosquito abundance, they'll respond to those areas. And they also respond through distributing educational materials. There's also, so this is an example of a CDC developed educational material. This is just part of it, but things that individuals can do and communities can do to control mosquito populations, like using sprays that control adult mosquitoes. So these are called adulticides. You can work in your own community to prevent mosquitoes from laying eggs by dumping out containers that have standing water in your, in your garden, for instance. You can purchase or have the vector control division provide larvicides that you can add to, for instance, ponds or fountains that can prevent the larvae from developing there and becoming adults. Now, I want to talk about the massive efforts that the Maricopa County does to actively monitor for infectious diseases, including West Nile virus in mosquito populations. So this is a map. This is Maricopa County, and Phoenix is in the center here. And each one of these dots is a trap that collects adult mosquitoes. And there are over 800 traps that are spread across the county. And these traps are set out once per week for every week in the year. And they're set for one night per week. And then folks at Maricopa Vector Control go out and collect these traps. They identify all the mosquito species that are present, and then they use molecular methods to test the mosquitoes for various pathogens, including West Nile virus. So this is a massive effort across the county to actively monitor and surveil for the presence of these pathogens. And you can see, because it's spread out so well, they understand where the virus is and where it is not over time in the county. So this can give them an idea of where to spray and control these mosquito populations. But I will say that these are mostly reactive measures of control. So the virus has to be present or someone has to complain in order for control to be initiated. Now, because of these massive surveillance efforts, they can quantify things like, how does the total mosquito abundance of mosquitoes that can transmit West Nile virus change throughout the year? So this is an example of one year, 2014, that had a big monsoon at the end of the year. And so we can see mosquito populations increase into the summer. They decline in the summer due to a combination of it's too hot, so they don't survive well as mitigation efforts like the adulticide and larvicide. And then they increase again, typically in the monsoon season, because the temperature is better and because there's more precipitation, giving more habitat for breeding. They also measure the mosquito infection rates with West Nile virus. So this axis here represents the infectious mosquitoes per 1,000. So if you sample 1,000 mosquitoes, how many of them will be infected with West Nile virus? And you can see that tends to kind of peak or be highest in the late summer months, early fall months, which corresponds to also when the birds are breeding and there are new birds in the environment due to migration. But this is just giving a picture of Maricopa County as a whole, looking across a massive spatial distribution. But West Nile virus exposure risk is not equal across the county. And for one reason this is true is because the climate is not, the climate in terms of temperature and precipitation is not consistent across the county. So these are two plots that are showing temperatures and precipitation across Maricopa County where the traps are set. And so again, this is Phoenix, and these colors represent, the darker colors here are hotter temperatures, and this is just in 1 month, averaged across 1 month in Maricopa County. So you can see some areas are hotter than others, and some areas receive more precipitation than others. And this impacts where there are going to be more mosquitoes, more birds, and more risk of West Nile virus. We also know, and we're starting to collect data on this, that the social determinants of health also vary across the county. So not just the climate in terms of temperature and precipitation, but what types of social economic situations folks are in that might influence their exposure. And so our research questions are trying to quantify these risks. So what are the ecological and social factors that influence risk across the county? And then if we can understand this, can we build a predictive framework of risk based on temperature, precipitation, and social factors? So we can actually use mathematics and computers to simulate how the virus spreads between birds and mosquitoes and humans. And we can use these tools to help us predict every week how much virus we should expect to see in the environment and how many mosquitoes there are in the environment. And so I'm not going to explain this figure, but we've built mathematical models. These are differential equations, if that's your thing, to explain the transmission between mosquitoes and birds and how the climate in terms of temperature and precipitation influence these dynamics. And we can use our model to make predictions. So here's an example. Sorry, this is a little fuzzy, but these black dots are those mosquito abundances that we saw before. These are real data. And then the green line and the green error ribbon represents our model's predictions of how many mosquitoes there should be in the environment based on the observed temperature and precipitation. And we've done this across about 20 years of data. And we see that our model is able to predict these patterns pretty well, although you can see where sometimes the data and the model don't match. And so right now we're working on trying to improve our model. And the way we're doing that is to try to account for spatial differences that I talked about in terms of spatial differences in climate as well as social factors across the county. And so these dots represent the different traps, and we can quantify the climate at each trap location as well as the social factors that are observed in the these lines represent the zip codes that are across Maricopa County. So we're trying to downscale our model, make it more spatially precise so that we can try to predict the number of mosquitoes that are in each location. And this is important because the mosquito abundances do vary across the county, and there's some hot spots. So this is just an example from 2019 where each dot is a trap, and the size of the dot represents how many mosquitoes they caught in those traps. So whilst most traps during 2019, during this time of year, it was a drought. So most traps had like only one or no or very small number of mosquitoes. Some areas had a massive amount, up to 5,000 mosquitoes. And we're trying to better understand what decides whether these areas represent hotspots for mosquitoes, which could influence the risk of transmission to humans. And so where are we headed with this research? So our ultimate goal is to create fine-scale, timely predictions of West Nile virus risk to provide advanced warning and supplement control efforts. So because part of control efforts are education in these communities, we hope to develop metrics that can be able to predict, okay, this week or maybe even this year is going to be really bad for West Nile virus in these particular locations. So let's get on the ground and provide information to those communities or the county as a whole to educate these and provide control efforts that way. And so this research is definitely ongoing, and we're making big strides, but and we're working closely with our partners in government as well. And so with that, I just want to stop and see if there are any questions.
Joe, there was one question earlier in the chat from Stefan Sommer. And the question is, which species of birds can be carriers? Which species of culex carry the West Nile virus in our area?
Thanks for those questions, Stefan. So there are many species of birds that can be carriers of West Nile virus. Sparrows, doves, grackles, crows, kind of you name it. There's a varying degree of how good those bird species are for the virus. So some of the birds have a higher viral load inside them, and so it's easier for them to transmit to mosquitoes. And then the primary mosquito vectors in Maricopa County and up here in Flagstaff are two species of culex, which are Quincke fasciitis and tarsalis. And I'm not an expert on mosquito biology, but I also know that there are some other mosquitoes that can rarely transmit the virus as well. I just saw another one pop up here. So how will climate change affect the prevalence of West Nile virus in the future? Many species of mosquito are moving northward because of climate change. That's a great question. That's kind of where we're headed as well, is if we can predict how climate is influencing these dynamics. In theory, we should be able to use climate change projections to understand that better. But it's hard to say at this point. I don't have a great answer to that because we have to understand the role of climate on both the birds and the mosquitoes and their interactions. I would say that if it gets hot, that's pretty bad for the mosquitoes, but it doesn't necessarily mean that risk will go down because it also depends on how much virus is in the birds and how many birds are present. Okay.
Joe, while you are reading the next question, I just want to offer a friendly encouragement that feel free to unmute yourselves and ask your questions directly to Joseph, because I think that helps a lot with the engagement as part of this co-learning, collective learning. So I just wanted to offer that, but if you feel comfortable just putting it in chat, you can continue to do so. I just wanted to offer that.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just read through the chat, and then if there's time after that, we can do anyone open their mic. But so another climate change question: will, as climate change warms northern Arizona, will West Nile virus spread northward, for instance, to Yavapai County? I can't answer that question with much certainty, but it makes logical sense to me. And we know that, for instance, Aedes aegypti, which is a mosquito species that hasn't normally been in Arizona, its distribution is moving northward and has gone now from southern North America and Central America up into Arizona, including Yavapai County. So I imagine that, yes, mosquito populations could move and could change the risk. Are the mosquito species already moving northward? Some are, yes. Do birds have any symptoms from virus being present in them? Yes, so some birds are highly susceptible to the virus, and West Nile virus is actually what you could consider an invasive virus in North America. It came from I'm pretty sure Europe, and in the early 90s, and spread from Northeast US towards the West in kind of a wave-like fashion. And when it first arrived, it was associated with massive mortality events in birds, and that can still happen. But birds can also develop resistance to the virus, so immunity. But birds are not born with immunity. So young birds that get the virus can still die. And there are certain species like crows that tend to be really susceptible to the virus. Do you know if there are partnerships between Arizona counties and tribal nations for West Nile virus mitigation testing on reservations? I don't know the answer to that, I'm sorry to say, but it's a great question. And I'm sure someone does know the answer to that, and I'll try to look that up. Thanks for these awesome questions.
I have another question. I was wondering, is there any sort of push to create a vaccine for West Nile virus, or is that kind of not happening?
I don't know. I don't really know. I imagine folks are working on it. I do know it's kind of complicated by two things. There's not as much funding for it because it isn't as prevalent of a disease as other diseases. So if you can imagine the amount of funding that goes towards COVID vaccines or drug treatments right now versus West Nile virus, there's a big disparity there. But also because of the biology of the virus and how it actually causes disease in humans is really complicated. The virus actually migrates along the nervous system. And because of that, it's hard to develop treatments that attack that, because it could attack the nervous system. So it's kind of complicated. It's almost like rabies in that way, where it's just hard to develop treatments that attack it once you figure out that someone's infected with it.
Okay, that makes sense. And then is there any like preventative methods that they could do like upstream, like to prevent the birds from getting it in the first place? Like, do they know where it's coming from, how the birds are getting it?
Well, it's naturally circulating in the bird populations just from their interactions with mosquitoes. And so in Maricopa County, there are resident bird species that are here year round. So, and because the mosquitoes are also here year round, they just kind of have this natural cycle of infection. But in other areas, it's primarily driven by the migration of birds from other places. So you can imagine a bird that's infected from way far away stops over in your area to breed or just to pick up resources and gets a mosquito infected. And then that starts an outbreak in the resident bird populations. So it's pretty complicated, but there's not like a source of the virus in the environment other than the birds and the mosquitoes. And so really to control infection, the focus has been on reducing the mosquito populations because there's not a medicine that can get rid of it in the birds.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Great questions. Thanks.
I have a question. So what efforts do you know of that are already underway, kind of like at any level, like national or here, state or locally, to document and start to address those social determinants of health around, you know, the social factors you were talking around mosquito risk infection? And then also, do you know, like, is there, okay, maybe I'll just leave it at that because that's a different question. That's my question.
Okay, thanks, Dulce. So it's a great question, and the answer is very little has been done to understand the socioeconomic social determinants of health framework of West Nile virus in particular. There has been some work, and I just want to shout out to Whitney Haliva Eklund, who's a PhD student at NAU, and Crystal Hepp, who is her advisor, that are kind of spearheading this with in terms of Aedes aegypti, which is a mosquito that can transmit dengue, for instance. So there's been some work in dengue and other, like, I guess, more widespread or more human detrimental pathogens of mosquitoes like malaria. And so there's been some work, but very little in the United States and very little with West Nile virus. But Whitney's working on it.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question was as far as the cases, like the people who are already, you know, showing severe illness from infection or who are dying. Is there demographic information collected on that, like race, ethnicity, and income, education, all those kinds of factors?
Yes, and we after a year of negotiations, we do finally have the access to human case data at a zip code level in Maricopa County. So we're going to start exploring those questions.
Thank you.
Joe, I had a question. How do you feel, or what's the science, both on this mass attempt to use adulticides? And you kind of talked about where things breed, and it just makes me wonder about that approach and the sustainability of that type of approach when you're using a chemical that gets into the, can it get into the water? Or can what's that impact, I guess?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm not a huge expert in all of could this chemical impact human health sort of thing. But I will say that the chemicals that they use, there's a lot of education behind them. You can go to the CDC and they try to educate people on how these are human, how would I say it? They're not detrimental to humans. But they are generalist insecticides, so it could have other ecological consequences. What else do I want to say about that? So, yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer that, but they are EPA approved chemicals. So I'll just kind of leave it at that. Sorry, Sam.
No, that makes sense. And my other question for you, more of like a policy question or possibly a political question, is why do you think it's taken so long for race and ethnicity and other type of determinant types of variables or data to be released? What's the lag time on that to try to understand disparity, I guess, on this particular issue?
I think there are different aspects of that. So one is just that there are other priorities because this disease doesn't have as many cases as other diseases. No one's really asked until Crystal did, I would say, and at least in Arizona. And another aspect of it is that the folks that get disease that get severe disease, I should say, are not always, but often more of the elderly population. And I don't know if that has something to do with it. And so it doesn't, it's hard to say for sure, but I think just for various reasons, the impetus hasn't been there to look at these questions. But I think what's interesting and data that Crystal's group are going to start collecting are, it's not just severe disease. You could get other types of infections, and we don't really know the health consequences long-term of those. And there's no monitoring done to figure out, like in a surveillance way, like how many people got infected generally this year. But you could do those types of studies to better understand the disparities as well as overall risk.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. And I see that that Stefan contributed in the chat. Most of the insecticides being used are synthetic pyrethroids and extremely toxic to all insects and other invertebrates. Probably part of the global insect apocalypse, which is bad. I also wanted to mention that these mosquitoes can actually develop resistance over time to the pyrethroids. So that's something that Crystal's group is also studying. And so that makes it so that you have to spray more or try to find some other option.
Yeah, if I could,
Go ahead.
sorry, the synthetic pyrethroids, have LD50 values in the parts per billion. And so I used to work for the EPA in DC for a little while, and they were triggering requirements for field studies for every new synthetic pyruvate. But it turns out they had me doing a study on how many non-target species were killed, and there were just thousands of published studies, and this was back in the 80s. The synthetic pyruvate are incredibly toxic, and they're probably one of the big things behind the global insect apocalypse. Many parts of the globe have seen greater than 75% decline in insect populations.
Yeah, because it just feels like I feel like climate change sparks ideas about how to solve problems that have such crazy implications, both short and long term. And it does feel like we're chasing our tail in terms of that piece. And it's very curious to me. I don't work in that field, but it's curious to me how we make decisions.
Yeah, and that is also one of the reasons that the application of the insecticides is retroactive, like after an outbreak, or it's predominantly retroactive, like after a community says there are a lot of mosquitoes here and complains. So it's often in response to complaints, and then in response to the active surveillance. So if they find an area of traps that have a lot of disease, they'll spray in that area. And so they are very conscious about not trying to spray too much.
Has there been any push to do some sort of non-chemical solution to this, such as like introducing additional like bat populations, or like I know there's fish species that will eat like mosquito larvae if it's in water? Is there any push to do that rather than using the chemicals?
I'm not really sure. I know that there are some talks about kind of different traps that could attract and kill adults, things like that, that are less invasive, but I don't really know the status of those things. It's a good question though.
Yeah, I think all of these were great questions, and I just want to thank you all again for being such an interactive, engaging group. I want to leave with my own question before we start to wrap up. So my last question is, because SHERC has a responsibility and we're very much passionate about our duty of bringing together community members with researchers and academic folks at NAU who are doing research around different topics that impact or could impact health equity. I'm wondering if there's any opportunity with your team or maybe perhaps other teams at NAU who are also focusing on this West Nile virus work. Is there opportunity for community members to collaborate with you or work together and kind of inform some of your approaches?
That's a great question. I don't know if I have an awesome answer to that. We don't have any active like community participatory research or engagement. Right now, we're mostly kind of doing the basic research in the background to try to figure out some of these things. But that said, Arizona Department of Health Services, they actively collect complaints from or feedback from the community about West Nile virus. They distribute education through the mail and things like that. But I think that's a good question. And with other folks that are more engaged in that kind of research, I'd be happy to talk with them and get them in touch with Crystal, who does a lot of the liaison work with the state government, and see what kind of opportunities there would be for that.
Perfect. Thank you, Joseph. So as we quickly wrap up, allow me to just bring up a couple of slides that we have left remaining. So let me put this in presentation mode. All right. So if you're interested in continuing this conversation with Joseph and want to learn more about his continuing work on this, you can email him. There is his email address. We will also, after this presentation, send an email out to all of our participants with this information as well. So if you're wondering more about what we do with the Fairness First campaign at the Southwest Health Equity Research Collaborative at NAU, you'll see in yellow here is our website address, and you can learn about some of the different initiatives that we have going on. If you want to continue this conversation online with your own networks, please use our hashtags. We have FFX Talks and then hashtag Fairness First X. And we're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, and we're also on Twitter if you want to connect with us. So going forward, again, as I had mentioned, these are bi-monthly, every other month conversations that we have with various researchers at NAU who are doing health equity work. So we want to hear about your thoughts. What did you think about this presentation, the topic? Are there any other future topics you would like for us to cover? If you have your phone handy, of course, you can scan that QR code there, or you can go to this URL, tinyurl.com/FFX-talk2, and that should bring up an evaluation form for you. Again, thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you again at a future presentation. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.